I saved for years to take my mom on a trip to Europe, but she refused because it wasn't first class. You're a horrible daughter, my mom's voice thundered through the phone, cutting through the quiet of my apartment like a cold slap. I froze. My grip on the phone tightened. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, she snapped. After all I've done for you, you couldn't even upgrade me to first class for this trip. What kind of child does that to their mother? I exhaled sharply, leaning against the kitchen counter for support. This wasn't the first time my mom had blindsided me with her overblown expectations, but it didn't sting any less. Mom, I paid for your entire trip, I said, even forcing myself to stay calm. Flights, the hotel, the tours, everything. Do you even realize how much time and effort went into planning this? She scoffed. And yet you couldn't do this one small thing to make it special. Honestly, Kristen, I don't know what's wrong with your sister would have done it without a second thought. There it was, the inevitable comparison to Danielle, my sister, the golden child, who could do no wrong despite barely holding down a job or contributing financially to anything. Meanwhile, I, the dependable, overachieving, responsible daughter, was always falling short. My name is Kristen, and for as long as I can remember, I've been walking a tightrope of my mom's expectations. No matter how hard I try, it's never, and this trip to Europe was supposed to be my way of bridging the gap between us, of showing my mom that I care. I'd saved for years, scrimping on vacations, skipping nights out, and taking on extra work to make it happen. I planned every detail meticulously. Flights, upscale accommodations, guided tours, even tickets to cultural performances she'd always dreamed of attending. But none of that mattered. All she could focus on was that her seat on the plane wasn't in first class. Mom, I said carefully, trying to inject some reason into the conversation. It's a beautiful itinerary. You're going to have an amazing time. Not in coach, I won't, she spat. Her words landed like a slap, but I bit back the anger rising in my chest. I hope you enjoy the trip anyway, I said curtly before ending the call. Later that afternoon, as I dropped her off at the airport, her parting words sliced deeper than I expected. Maybe if you ever grow up, you'll figure out how to treat people properly, she said, breezing into the tunnel without a backward glance. Driving home, her words echoed in my mind, sharp and cutting. A lump formed in my throat, but I forced it down. I wasn't going to cry. Not over this. I had worked so hard to make this trip perfect, a gesture of love and gratitude, and instead, it had become another reason for her to belittle me. No matter what I did, it was never good enough. As I parked outside my apartment, something shifted inside me. If she thought I was a horrible daughter, maybe it was time for her to feel the weight of her own entitlement. The next few days passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the conversation. Sitting at my laptop, I opened the confirmation email for her flights. My eyes landed on the small blue button next to her return ticket, Manage Booking. A wild idea crossed my mind. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Was this too much? Was it cruel? Her voice replayed in my head. Maybe if you ever grow up. The hesitation disappeared, and with a single click, the return flight was canceled. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control. The first few days after I canceled my mom's return flight were oddly quiet. Too quiet. No texts, no calls, just her steady stream of social media posts documenting the dream trip I had meticulously planned for her. Each post was a polished picture, perfect highlight, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, sipping champagne on a Seine river cruise, posing in front of ornate palace gates. Her captions dripped with enthusiasm. Living the dream. Grateful for this once-in-a-lifetime experience. There was no mention of me. No acknowledgement of the years I'd spent saving and planning. No gratitude. Just her basking in the glow of an adventure she hadn't even lifted a finger to organize. I told myself to let it go, to focus on the fact that she was having a good time, but each post felt like another twist of the night. Then, 3 days before her scheduled return, the text started. Kristen, why does my return flight say canceled? Fix this immediately. I stared at the screen, a bitter satisfaction curling at the corners of my mouth. So she'd finally noticed. Instead of replying, I left her message on read and went back to the book I'd been trying to distract myself with. But the next morning, the phone call started. Kristen, she barked when I finally picked up, her voice sharp and demanding. What's going on with my flight? I just called the airline and they said the ticket was canceled. Did you do this? Yes, I did, I said, my tone calm but firm. What? She screeched. Why would you do that? Because I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be left hanging, I replied. You've spent my entire life taking me for granted, Mom. After everything I did to make this trip special for you, all you could do was criticize me and call me a horrible daughter. I'm done letting you treat me like this. There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she said, You're being ridiculous. This is petty, Kristen. You've embarrassed me. I let out a bitter laugh. Embarrassed you? Really? Do you have any idea how many times you've embarrassed me, Mom? How many times you've made me feel small, no matter what I did for you? Her tone softened, but it wasn't sincere. It was calculated. Kristen, be reasonable. I'm stranded in a foreign country. What am I supposed to do? You're not stranded, I said evenly. You can book another flight. Or maybe Danielle can help you. You know Danielle doesn't have the money for that, she snapped. Then I guess you'll have to figure it out, I said, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. She let out a sharp gasp. Kristen, I'm your mother. You can't just abandon me like this. You abandoned me a long time ago, I said quiet before ending the call. The fallout was swift. My sister Danielle called later that afternoon, her tone half curious, half concerned. Kristen, Mom's freaking out. She says you canceled her ticket. Is that true? Yes, I said, bracing myself for the lecture. Why? Because I'm tired of being taken advantage of, I replied. She called me a horrible daughter after I spent years saving for this trip. She's never appreciated me, Dan, and I'm done letting her walk all over me. Danielle sighed. I get it, Kristen. I really do. But don't you think this is a bit extreme? No, I said firmly. It's not extreme. It's necessary. She needs to learn that her actions have consequences. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A tiny part of me felt guilty. After all, she was my mom. But the larger part of me felt something else, relief. For the first time, I wasn't bending to her will. The next morning, I woke up to a string of texts from her. Kristen, I'm sorry. Please just help me get home. You're right. I haven't treated you fairly. I'll do better. I stared at the messages for a long moment, trying to decide if I believed her. Her words sounded sincere, but they had before. Was this a genuine apology or just a desperate attempt to manipulate me? Finally, I replied, I'll book your return flight, but this is the last time. If you can't treat me with respect, don't expect me to keep bending over backward for you. Her response came quickly. Thank you. I promise I'll do better. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but as I hit confirm on her new booking, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, control. This time, I was setting the terms. The breaking point came the day after I had reluctantly booked my mom's return flight. I woke up to find an unexpected email from my bank. Alert. Unusual activity detected. My heart sank as I quickly logged into my account. My stomach churned when I saw the transaction. A large withdrawal had been made from my savings account, wiping out almost everything I had left. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stared at the screen, willing it to be a mistake. But the details of the transaction were clear. The money had been transferred to an account in my mom's name. Anger boiled in my chest as I realized what had happened. She had my bank details. She must have kept them from years ago when I was still in college, trying to get my finances in order. And now she'd used them to steal from me. I grabbed my phone and called her immediately, my hands shaking with rage. Kristen, I was just about to call you, she said, her voice annoyingly chipper. What the hell did you do? I snapped, skipping the pleasantries. Excuse me, the money, Mom. You took money out of my account, almost all of it. Her pause was just long enough to confirm her guilt. Kristen, I needed it, she said finally, her tone defensive. After everything you've put me through, I think I'm entitled to a little support. I'm your mother. Entitled? I spat, my voice trembling with fury. You stole from me, Mom. After I paid for your entire trip, you went behind my back and drained my savings. I didn't steal, she said stubbornly. It's not like you couldn't spare it. You don't have a family to support, and I was in a bind. You'll be fine. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Do you even hear yourself? Do you even care how much damage you've done? That money was supposed to go toward my future, my stability. You had no right. You're being dramatic, she said, brushing me off. It's just money. You'll make more. Her words hit me like a slap. I had spent years sacrificing for her, and this was how she repaid me. Enough, I said, my voice cold and steady. You've crossed the line for the last time. I'm done. Done, she repeated, her tone mocking. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm cutting you off, I said firm. No more money. No more trips. No more cleaning up your messes. You've taken advantage of me for the last time. You can't just walk away from your family, she shouted, her voice rising in anger. Watch me, I said, before ending the call. The next steps were clear. I contacted my bank, reported the unauthorized transaction, and froze my accounts. I also called my lawyer to start the process of reclaiming my stolen money. The fallout was swift and brutal. My mom tried every tactic she could think of, guilt-tripping, pleading, and even roping in Danielle to mediate. She's really upset, Danielle said over the phone. She's saying you're abandoning her. Danielle, She stole $1,000 from me, I replied. If you want to help her, be my guest. But I'm done. For the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down. That evening, I sat in my apartment, drained but resolute. The guilt and heartbreak lingered, but underneath it all, there was a growing sense of freedom. For years, I had let my mom's manipulation dictate my life. But now, I was taking it back. As I looked out at the city lights, one thought stood out. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was finally free. The days after I cut my mom off were a storm of chaos and confrontation. She didn't waste a second before escalating the situation, calling me repeatedly, leaving voicemails alternating between anger and desperation. I ignored them all, my resolve unwavering, but she wasn't going to let it end there. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of Facebook posts. It's a sad day when your own child turns their back on their family. After everything I've done, this is how I'm treated, betrayed, and abandoned. Some people have no sense of loyalty. Any of the comments poured in, filled with sympathy for her and veiled jabs at me. You don't deserve this. Some kids are just so ungrateful, one read. Another chimed in. You're such a strong woman. Don't let her get away with this. The audacity made my blood boil. She was painting herself as the victim, conveniently leaving out the part where she had stolen from me. I called her. I had to. What do you think you're doing? I demanded as soon as she picked up. Speaking my truth, she said smugly. If you're so ashamed of your actions, maybe you should reflect on them. My actions, I shot back. You stole from me, Mama. And now, you're trying to manipulate everyone into thinking I'm the villain? Unbelievable. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm your mother. I was entitled to that money. You weren't entitled to anything, I snapped. You crossed a line and now you're facing the consequences. Stop playing the victim because no one's buying it anymore. Her voice softened, but it was the same calculated tone I knew too well. Kristen, can't we just fix this? We're family. Family forgives. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Family doesn't mean sacrificing your own peace and happiness to enable someone else's selfishness. You've hurt me too many times, and I'm done pretending it's okay. If you want to fix this, start by taking accountability. Until then, I'm out. I hung up before she could reply. That night, I sat on my couch, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, anger, sadness. Cutting ties with my mom felt like ripping off a band-aid. Necessary, but still painful. I'd spent so many years trying to win her approval, trying to fix something that was never mine to fix. But for the first time, I felt free. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I contacted my bank to finalize the fraud report, secured my accounts, and worked with my lawyer to ensure my mom couldn't access anything else. I leaned on my closest friend, Mia, who had been my rock through this entire ordeal. One evening, as we sat on her balcony with glasses of wine, she said, I'm proud of you, Kristen. I know how hard this must be, but you've done the right thing. I know, I said, staring at the skyline, but it doesn't make it hurt any less. Of course not, she replied. But now you can start living for you. That's worth everything. She was right. I started filling my days with things that brought me joy, yoga classes, reconnecting with old friends, and even planning a solo trip to Italy. It felt strange at first, doing things for myself without the shadow of my mom's demands looming over me. But slowly, I started to feel lighter. Every so often, I'd get a text from my sister, Danielle. At first, she was angry, trying to guilt me into fixing things with Mom. But eventually, her messages softened. Mom's been quiet late, she texted one up. I think she's realizing she pushed too far. She hasn't admitted it yet, but she's changed a little. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but it didn't matter. My peace wasn't contingent on whether or not my mom changed. It was rooted in the boundaries I had finally set. One evening, as I sat on my own balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The guilt and frustration were still there, but they no longer consumed me. For the first time, I was living my life on my own terms, and I wasn't going back. The months following my decision to cut ties with my mom were both challenging and liberating. For the first time in years, I was no longer weighed down by the constant pull of her demands or the endless cycle of guilt and disappointment. It wasn't easy, but as I settled into my new reality, I realized just how much space her presence had occupied and I started rebuilding piece by piece. My first priority was reclaiming my time. For years, my schedule had revolved around her, managing her crises, handling her problems, and putting her needs above my own. Now I was free to focus on the things that brought me joy. I signed up for pottery classes at a studio downtown, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy. The first time I molded clay into something resembling a vase, I felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, a tangible symbol of the life I was creating for myself. I also began reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from. One Saturday, Mia and I went hiking. And as we stood at the top of the trail overlooking the city, she turned to me with a smile. "You seem lighter, Christian," she said, "like you're finally letting go." "I think I am," I admitted, feeling the truth of my own words. Work became a source of pride rather than an escape. Without the constant stress of my mom's demands, I was able to pour my energy into projects that excited me. I pitched new ideas, took on challenges, and even earned a promotion. For the first time in years, I felt like I was thriving. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about my mom through Danielle. "She's been different lately," Danielle told me during a coffee date, "quieter, more reflective. I think she misses you." Part of me wanted to reach out, but I knew it wasn't the right time. I wasn't ready to reopen that door, not until I was sure it wouldn't lead back to the same toxic cycle. Then one day, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably hers. "Kristen," it began, "I've had a lot of time to think since everything happened. I realize now how much I've hurt you and how unfair I've been. You were right to set boundaries, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I don't know if you're ready to forgive me, but I hope we can try to rebuild things on your terms this time." I read the letter twice, emotions swirling. For years, I had dreamed of an apology like this, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part of me was cautious, unwilling to let my guard down too quickly. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself fully embracing my fresh start. I planned a solo trip to Italy, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting, wandering through the cobblestone streets of Florence, tasting gelato by the Arno River, and standing in awe before the Sistine Chapel. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known before. The trip wasn't just about seeing the world. It was about proving to myself that I could live fully and joyfully without seeking anyone's approval. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't just about standing up to my mom. It was about standing up for myself. For so long, I had tied my worth to her validation, bending over backward to prove I was enough. But now, I understood that my worth wasn't something anyone else could define. By the time I returned home, I felt like a new person, stronger, freer, and more at peace with myself. Eventually, I decided to respond to my mom's letter. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple note. "Thank you for your apology. I need more time, but I appreciate your effort. I hope we can find a way forward." It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was a step. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, I felt a quiet happiness settle over me. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Story 2. You're nothing more than a distraction, a gold digger playing the long game. Trust me, once I'm done, he'll see right through you. Eleanor's words were ice cold, her expression calm as if she were discussing the weather. I sat there frozen, gripping the handle of my mug so tightly, I thought it might crack. I wanted to say something back to defend myself, but I didn't. Back then, I thought staying polite and composed would win her over eventually. I couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 28, and I was head over heels for Daniel, the most incredible man I'd ever met. He came from wealth, a world I never imagined being a part of. His family practically owned half the city, thanks to their massive tech company, and he was poised to inherit a huge chunk of it someday. But none of that mattered to me. I grew up in a small town, working hard as a librarian to make ends meet. Daniel loved me for who I was, not what I had, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and valued. But his mother, Eleanor, despised me from the start. She saw me as nothing more than a fortune hunter. And no matter how kind or respectful I tried to be, she made it clear that she would never accept me. Her disdain wasn't subtle. It was woven into every interaction we had. She'd make snide comments about my clothes, about how I seemed sweet but simple, or how Daniel needed someone more ambitious to support his future endeavors. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just her way of testing me. But deep down, her words stung. Of course, Daniel never saw this side of her. Around him, she was the picture of a loving, supportive mother. She wouldn't criticize me outright when he was in the room, but I could feel her icy glares, and catch her condescending tone whenever I spoke. When I tried to bring it up to Daniel, he'd brush it off, saying things like, "She just needs time, sir. She's protective of me." That's all. I wanted to believe him, so I stayed quiet. But things started getting worse. As Daniel and I got closer to setting a wedding date, Eleanor's comments became sharper, her subtle digs turning into outright accusations. One evening, while Daniel was out with his friends, she cornered me in their grand foyer. "You're not fooling anyone, you know," she said, her voice low but firm. "Daniel might be too blind to see it, but I know your type. Small town girl latches onto the first rich man who shows her attention. Classic. I stood there stunned, not knowing how to respond. I wasn't after Daniel's money, and I'd done nothing to suggest otherwise. But Eleanor wasn't interested in the truth. She'd already made up her mind about me. At first, I told myself I could endure it. Daniel and I loved each other, and that was all that mattered. But the constant tension, the whispered insults, the way she manipulated situations to paint me as the villain, it started to wear me down. Still, I didn't think she would go as far as she eventually did. One evening, after another tense dinner with Eleanor, I called my best friend, Chloe. She'd always been my rock, the one person I could count on to listen without judgment. "I don't know what to do, Annie," I said, pacing my small apartment, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windows. "Eleanor makes me feel like I'm some kind of criminal for loving Daniel. It's like she's just waiting for me to fail so she can say, 'I told you so.'" Chloe sighed on the other end of the line. "That woman has issues, Sarah. You've done nothing wrong. If anything, you've bent over backward to be nice to her. It's not your fault she's stuck in her ivory tab." I slumped onto the couch, rubbing my temples. "It's not just the insults. She says things to Daniel about me too. Things that aren't true. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I love him, but it's like I'm fighting a losing battle." "Have you told Daniel everything?" Chloe asked. I hesitated. "Not really. I mean, I've mentioned it here and there, but he brushes it off. He doesn't see what she's like when he's not around." Chloe's voice softened. "Sarah, you need to tell. He loves you. He deserves to know what she's doing." "I know," I said quietly. "But what if it just makes things worse?" The days that followed weren't any easier. I tried to muster the courage to have a real conversation with Daniel about his mother, but every time I brought it up, I faltered.